They sued me for stolen valor, claiming I was lying about my military rank. But when that 4-star general walked into the courtroom and rendered a perfect salute, their lawyer's jaw hit the floor. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors where my family sat smugly in their expensive suits, certain they were about to expose the biggest lie I'd ever told. What they didn't know was that the truth they were so desperate to uncover would shatter everything they thought they knew about me. The air was thick with tension and the scent of old wood and legal documents, and I could feel their eyes boring into the back of my neck as I sat quietly at the defendant's table. My brother Marcus adjusted his silk tie and whispered something to his wife that made her smirk. My sister Sarah tapped her manicured nails against her designer purse, probably calculating how much money they'd save on family gatherings once they proved I was a fraud. The courthouse felt like a cathedral of judgment, and I was their chosen sacrifice on the altar of family reputation. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. This story changed everything for my family, and I hope it reminds you that sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest truths. Growing up as the youngest of 3 children in the Peterson family meant growing up in the shadow of perfection. Marcus was the golden child, Harvard MBA, corner office at a Fortune 500 company, house in the suburbs that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Sarah was the family princess, married to a successful attorney, 2 perfect children, president of the country club auxiliary. Then there was me, David, the disappointment who barely graduated high school and enlisted in the army instead of going to college like a proper Peterson should. My parents never said it outright, but I could see it in their eyes every Christmas dinner, every family gathering, every phone call that lasted exactly long enough to be polite. I was the son who took the easy way out, who couldn't handle real responsibility, who chose to play soldier instead of building a real career. When I came back from my first deployment, they asked the expected questions with the enthusiasm of people discussing the weather. How was it over there? Did you see any action? Are you glad to be back? But their eyes glazed over when I tried to answer, and the conversation always shifted quickly to Marcus's latest promotion or Sarah's newest charity event. My father would pat my shoulder with the kind of distant affection you'd give a neighbor's dog, and my mother would ask if I was finally ready to think about going back to school for something practical. They saw the uniform as a costume, my service as an extended camping trip, my rank as something handed out like participation trophies. The family dynamic crystallized perfectly at Marcus's wedding 5 years ago. During the reception, the photographer was arranging family photos, and Marcus pulled me aside with that patronizing smile he'd perfected in business school. He straightened my dress uniform jacket like I was a child who couldn't dress himself properly. "The wedding guests are important people, David," he said quietly. "Maybe don't mention the military stuff too much tonight. You know how it makes people uncomfortable when you get all intense about it." Sarah nodded in agreement, her pearls catching the light from the chandeliers. "We just want tonight to be perfect," she added, "and you know how you can get when you start telling those stories." Those stories. That's what they called my service. Stories. Like I was making up bedtime tales to get attention. When I tried to explain why I couldn't talk about certain missions, they rolled their eyes and exchanged looks that said there goes David again with his secret agent fantasies. When I mentioned my security clearance, Marcus laughed and asked if that was like being a mall security guard but for the government. When I showed them photos of my unit, they nodded politely and changed the subject to Sarah's kitchen renovation. My mother once asked me why I couldn't just be normal like other people's sons who served their country and then came home to do something respectable. The breaking point came during last year's Thanksgiving dinner. We were sitting around the mahogany table that had been in our family for 3 generations, surrounded by crystal and china that cost more than most people's cars. Marcus was holding court about his latest business acquisition, gesturing with his wine glass as he described the complicated financial maneuvers that had made him richer. Sarah was showing off photos of her latest European vacation, the one where she'd stayed in castles and eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants. Then the conversation turned to me, sitting quietly at the end of the table in my simple button-down shirt and khakis. So David, my father said with that tone that meant he was about to make a point, when are you going to stop playing soldier and start thinking about your future? You're 32 years old. Most of your classmates are established in their careers by now. My mother nodded sympathetically, like I was a child who still believed in Santa Claus. We worry about you, sweetheart, she said. All this military business is fine for young men who don't have other options, but you're smart enough to do something real with your life. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Look, little brother, I've got connections. I could probably get you an entry-level position at my company. Nothing fancy, but it would be a start toward building an actual career. That's when I made my mistake. That's when I let my guard down just enough to tell them the truth they weren't ready to hear. I set down my fork carefully, looked around the table at these people who shared my blood, but had never really known me, and said quietly that I wasn't just playing soldier. I told them about my rank, about the missions I'd led, about the men and women who'd served under my command. I mentioned the decorations, the commendations, the responsibilities that kept me awake at night long after I'd returned to civilian life. I tried to explain why I couldn't just walk away from something that had shaped every fiber of who I was. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Marcus started laughing, not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the cruel kind that comes from disbelief and embarrassment. Sarah looked mortified, like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. My father's face turned red with what I recognized as shame, not for me, but because of me. My mother actually covered her face with her hands like she couldn't bear to look at me. Come on, David, Marcus said finally. We know you served, and we're proud of you for that, but let's not get carried away with the hero fantasies. You were enlisted, not an officer. You did your time and came home, just like thousands of other guys. There's no shame in that, but there's no need to embellish it either. The word embellish hit me like a physical blow. Sarah nodded in agreement, her voice taking on that patient tone she used with her children when they told obvious lies. We love you, David, she said, but this is exactly what we're talking about. You get so caught up in these military stories that you start believing your own exaggerations. It's not healthy. Maybe you should talk to someone about it. A professional. Marcus raised his wine glass in a mock toast. To my little brother, he announced to the table, who saved the world one parking lot at a time. The whole table erupted in laughter. The kind that comes from relief after an uncomfortable moment has been diffused with humor. I sat there listening to my family laugh at my service, at my sacrifices, at the parts of my life I'd never been able to share with them because they were classified above their security level. I watched my mother dab at her eyes with her linen napkin, not from tears of pride, but from tears of laughter at what she saw as my pathetic delusions of grandeur. My father was already changing the subject to something safer, asking Marcus about his golf game, steering the conversation back to territory where everyone knew their roles and no one had to confront uncomfortable truths about the son who'd chosen duty over dollars. After dinner, as we were saying our goodbyes in the foyer beneath the crystal chandelier that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, Marcus pulled me aside one more time. Listen, David, he said with what he probably thought was brotherly concern, we're worried about you. This whole military fantasy thing is getting out of hand. Maybe it's time to get some help, talk to someone about transitioning back to civilian life. There are programs for that, you know. Veterans who have trouble adjusting to the real world. Sarah appeared at his shoulder, nodding sagely like she'd just solved a complex puzzle. We've been talking, she said, and we think you might have what they call stolen valor syndrome. It's when veterans exaggerate their service to feel more important. It's actually pretty common. I drove home that night through the quiet suburban streets where I'd grown up, past the houses where my childhood friends had built their normal lives with their normal families who understood and supported them. The weight of my family's disbelief settled over me like a familiar uniform I couldn't take off. I'd spent years protecting them from the truth of what I'd done in service to our country, and in return, they'd decided I was a fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very classification levels that prevented me from defending myself were the same ones that had kept them safe while they slept peacefully in their suburban beds. But the worst was yet to come. Over the following months, my family's concern about my mental health evolved into something darker. They started researching stolen valor cases online, sharing articles with each other about fake veterans who lied about their service for attention or benefits. Marcus sent me links to news stories about people who'd been exposed as frauds, with subject lines like, "Thought you should see this," and "This sounds familiar." Sarah started asking pointed questions about my discharge papers, my DD-214, my medals. She wanted to see documentation, proof, evidence that what I claimed about my service was real. The final straw came when Marcus announced at a family barbecue that he'd been doing some investigation into my military claims. He stood up beside the grill, spatula in hand like a weapon, and addressed the assembled relatives with the confidence of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. He'd made some calls, he said. He'd reached out to some people he knew in government contracting. He'd done some research into my unit, my deployments, my supposed rank and responsibilities. And what he'd found, he announced with the satisfaction of someone exposing a long-running con game, was that none of it added up. According to his sources, there was no record of me holding the positions I claimed. No documentation of the missions I described. No evidence of the rank I said I'd achieved. The backyard went quiet except for the sound of hamburgers sizzling on the grill and children playing in the distance. My aunts and uncles, my cousins, my siblings' spouses, all turned to look at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to pity to outright disgust. My mother's sister actually gasped and put her hand to her chest like she'd just witnessed a terrible accident. My father's brother shook his head sadly and muttered something about how military service used to mean something in his day. Sarah's husband, the attorney, looked at me with the kind of professional assessment lawyers reserve for defendants they know are guilty. I could have tried to explain about classification levels, about operations that didn't exist in public records, about the difference between what shows up in standard databases and what actually happened in the field. I could have mentioned the security clearances that prevented certain aspects of my service from appearing in documents that civilian contractors could access. I could have talked about the nature of special operations and why they're special precisely because they don't leave paper trails for family members to Google. But I'd learned over the years that trying to explain the truth to people who'd already decided you were lying was like trying to teach calculus to someone who'd convinced themselves that mathematics was a hoax. Instead, I stood up slowly, set down my beer on the picnic table, and said quietly that I understood their concerns. I told them I was sorry they felt I'd deceived them. I said I respected their right to believe what they needed to believe about my service. And then I walked out of that backyard barbecue, past the swing set where I'd played as a child, past the garden where my mother had taught me to recognize different flowers, past the driveway where my father had taught me to change oil in my first car. And I knew that something fundamental had broken in my family that might never be repaired. But Marcus wasn't finished. 3 weeks later, I received legal papers served by a process server who found me at the small apartment I rented across town from the family neighborhood. My own brother, backed by Sarah and supported by our parents, was suing me for stolen valor. They were claiming that my false representations about my military service had damaged the family's reputation and caused them emotional distress. They wanted financial damages for the embarrassment I'd caused them in their social circles. They wanted a court order requiring me to stop making false claims about my service. They wanted me to issue a public apology admitting that I'd lied about my rank, my responsibilities, and my achievements in the military. The lawsuit was as thorough as it was devastating. Marcus had hired a private investigator who'd compiled a thick folder of evidence supporting their claim that I was a fraud. They had statements from people who said they'd never heard of me during my supposed deployments. They had documentation showing gaps in the public record of my service. They had testimony from military contractors who said they'd found no evidence of my participation in the operations I claimed to have led. They had psychological experts prepared to testify that I was suffering from delusions of grandeur related to my military service. Reading through the legal documents felt like watching my own family systematically destroy everything I'd ever been proud of. They'd turned my service into a lie, my sacrifices into fantasies, my honor into a mental health crisis. The brother who'd once looked up to me, the sister who'd once bragged about me to her friends, the parents who'd once displayed my graduation photo from basic training on their mantelpiece. had all decided that the easiest explanation for my silence about certain aspects of my service was that I'd made it all up. The media attention started almost immediately. Someone leaked the story to the local newspaper, probably Marcus's attorney looking for publicity for his firm. The headline read, "Local family sues brother for stolen valor claims," and the article painted me as a disturbed veteran who'd fabricated an elaborate fantasy about his military career to gain respect and attention from his successful family. The story spread to military blogs and veterans forums, where people who'd never met me debated whether I was a fraud or a victim of family dysfunction. My photo appeared alongside known stolen valor cases, my face forever associated with shame and deception in the minds of people who'd never heard my side of the story. I found myself in the surreal position of being prosecuted by my own family for the crime of telling them the truth about my service. The truth I'd spent years hiding from them to protect both national security and their own peace of mind had become the evidence they were using to destroy me. The very classification levels that prevented me from defending myself publicly were being used as proof that I was lying. The security clearances that kept me silent were being interpreted as evidence that I had nothing to hide because there was nothing real to hide. My court-appointed attorney was a tired-looking public defender who specialized in petty crimes and domestic disputes. He looked through my case file with the expression of someone who'd already decided how it would end. "Mr. Peterson," he said during our first meeting, "I have to be honest with you. Your family has put together a pretty compelling case. Unless you can produce documentation that supports your claims about your military service, this is going to be an uphill battle. The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that what you told them was true. Can you do that?" I sat in his cramped office looking at the stack of legal papers that represented my family's systematic demolition of my military career, and I realized that the moment of truth I'd been avoiding for years was finally here. The secrets I'd kept to protect national security, the classification levels that had kept me silent, the security clearances that had governed every aspect of my service. All of it was about to be tested in a civilian courtroom where the rules were different and the stakes were higher than my family could possibly imagine. That night, I made a phone call I'd never thought I'd have to make. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who understood the weight of the secrets I'd been carrying, someone who had the authority to decide whether those secrets were worth protecting at the cost of my family's respect and my own reputation. The conversation was brief and conducted in the careful language we'd learned to use when discussing matters that couldn't be discussed. I explained the situation, outlined the legal challenge I was facing, and asked for guidance on how to proceed without compromising operational security or violating the oaths I'd sworn. The response came back through official channels 3 days later. A manila envelope delivered to my apartment by a courier who required 2 forms of identification and a signature that would be verified against samples in a secure database. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a phone number and instructions to call at exactly 1800 hours Eastern Standard Time. When I made that call, the voice on the other end was familiar, professional, and direct. The situation had been reviewed at the highest levels. A decision had been made. Arrangements were being put in place. I was to proceed to court as scheduled and trust that the truth, when it was time for the truth to be revealed, would speak for itself. 3 days before the court hearing, I received another phone call, this one from a number I didn't recognize, but a voice I'd never forget. General Patricia Morrison, the 4-star general who'd pinned my last promotion, who'd shaken my hand after my final mission, who'd personally thanked me for service that couldn't be acknowledged in any public record. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm and authoritative, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected national security. "David," she said, "I understand you're having some family troubles. I'm going to be in the area next week. I think it might be time we had a conversation about your service record." The morning of the court hearing arrived gray and cold, with the kind of autumn mist that makes everything look uncertain and dreamlike. I put on my only suit, the same one I'd worn to job interviews and funerals, and drove to the courthouse where my family was waiting to prove that I was a fraud. The parking lot was fuller than I'd expected, filled with news vans and reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. Local TV crews were setting up their equipment, preparing to broadcast what they expected would be the public humiliation of another fake veteran. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching my family arrive in Marcus's BMW, all of them dressed for victory, confident that by the end of the day they'd have their apology and their vindication. I walked through the courthouse doors knowing that everything was about to change, that the secrets I'd kept for years were about to be revealed in the most public way possible, and that my family was about to learn the difference between what they thought they knew about my service and what I'd actually done in the shadows, where heroes don't get parades and sacrifice doesn't get recognition. The marble floors echoed with the sound of my footsteps as I made my way to the courtroom where the truth was finally going to set us all free, even if it destroyed everything my family thought they understood about honor, duty, and the son they'd never really known. The courtroom was exactly what you'd expect from a building constructed in the 1960s, all dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly green around the edges. I took my seat at the defendant's table and watched my family file into the gallery behind the plaintiff's side, their faces set with the grim satisfaction of people who were finally going to be proven right. Marcus nodded to his attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richardson who specialized in high-profile cases and had probably seen this as an easy win to add to his portfolio. Sarah sat beside our parents, her hand resting protectively on our mother's arm like she was shielding her from the embarrassment I was about to cause. The reporters filled the back rows, their cameras and notebooks ready to document what they expected would be another routine stolen valor prosecution. What none of them knew, what I'd never been able to tell them, was the real story of what I'd done during those years they thought I was playing soldier. The story that began 12 years ago when I was selected for a program that officially didn't exist, trained for missions that never appeared in any public record, and given responsibilities that required a security clearance so high that acknowledging its existence was itself classified. The story of how a kid from suburban Connecticut who barely graduated high school became one of the most decorated soldiers in modern American military history, with commendations that would never see the inside of a display case and achievements that could never be mentioned at family dinners. It started during my second deployment to Afghanistan, when I was still just a regular infantry soldier trying to prove myself to a unit that saw me as another suburban kid who'd watched too many war movies. I'd been in country for 6 months, had seen enough combat to understand that war wasn't anything like the movies, and was starting to develop the kind of situational awareness that separates soldiers who come home from soldiers who don't. That's when Captain Williams pulled me aside after a particularly difficult patrol and asked if I'd ever considered applying for specialized training. He didn't say what kind of training, didn't mention any program names, just asked if I was interested in serving my country in ways that went beyond the normal scope of infantry operations. The selection process took place at a facility that wasn't on any map, conducted by instructors whose names we never learned and whose faces we were trained to forget. For 6 months, they broke us down and built us back up into something that wasn't quite soldier and wasn't quite spy, but was perfectly suited for the gray areas where conventional military operations ended and other things began. We learned languages that weren't taught in regular army schools, combat techniques that weren't in any manual, and operational procedures that existed only in the minds of the people who developed them over decades of shadow warfare. Of the 43 soldiers who started the program, only 7 of us made it through to the end. My first mission was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance operation in a region of Afghanistan that was officially peaceful, but actually crawling with Taliban leadership planning their next major offensive. I was to pose as a civilian contractor, establish a cover identity that would get me close to the targets, and gather intelligence that conventional assets couldn't obtain. The mission was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 4 months, during which I became someone else entirely, lived a life that existed only in false documents and careful lies, and gathered intelligence that prevented what could have been the largest terrorist attack on American soil since September 11th. When I came back from that mission, I wasn't the same person who'd left. I'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone, and learned truths about the world that made normal civilian life feel like an elaborate stage play performed by actors who didn't know they were acting. But I was good at it, better than my instructors had expected, better than I'd expected myself to be. I had a talent for becoming invisible, for blending into backgrounds, for making people trust me enough to reveal secrets they'd die to protect. Within 2 years, I was leading my own operations, commanding other soldiers who'd been through the same transformation I had, taking responsibility for missions that could change the course of history if they succeeded or destroy lives if they failed. The missions blurred together over the years, each one more complex and dangerous than the last. I spent 3 months in Syria posing as a journalist to get close to a cell that was planning chemical weapons attacks on European cities. I lived for 6 months in Somalia as a humanitarian aid worker while tracking the financial networks that funded international terrorism. I was a graduate student in Pakistan, a businessman in Yemen, a tourist in Iran, each identity carefully constructed and completely believable. Each mission successful in ways that could never be acknowledged publicly, but saved lives in ways that would never be counted. The hardest part wasn't the danger, or the constant lying, or even the loneliness of living multiple lives simultaneously. The hardest part was coming home to a family who saw my absence and assumed failure, who looked at my civilian clothes and modest apartment and concluded that I'd wasted my potential, who couldn't understand why I seemed different after each deployment because they didn't know that the person who came back wasn't quite the same person who'd left. Every Christmas dinner where they asked about my career prospects, every family gathering where they wondered aloud when I'd get serious about my future, every conversation where they compared my apparent lack of achievement to Marcus's corner office and Sarah's country club membership, I had to smile and nod and let them believe I was the family disappointment. The decorations started accumulating after my 3rd year in the program. The Bronze Star for the mission in Afghanistan that prevented the terrorist attack. The Silver Star for the operation in Syria that stopped the chemical weapons plot. The Distinguished Service Cross for the infiltration in Somalia that dismantled an entire terrorist financing network. Each medal came with a ceremony that took place in a windowless room with no cameras and no witnesses except the handful of people who knew what I'd actually done. Each commendation was immediately classified and locked away in files that would remain sealed for decades. Each achievement became another secret I carried alone. By my 7th year in Special Operations, I'd been promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, then full colonel, each rank coming with greater responsibility and deeper secrecy. I was commanding missions across 3 continents, coordinating with intelligence agencies whose names were acronyms most people had never heard, briefing generals and cabinet members on threats that would never appear in newspaper headlines because we'd eliminated them before they could develop. I had a staff of analysts, linguists, and operators who trusted me with their lives. And I had access to intelligence that painted a picture of global security threats that would have terrified my family if they'd known even a fraction of what I dealt with every day. The promotion to general came after the mission that even now, sitting in this courtroom, I can't fully describe without violating oaths that supersede family loyalty and personal reputation. What I can say is that it involved a terrorist organization that had acquired nuclear materials, a plot that would have made September 11th look like a minor incident, and an operation that required me to spend 8 months living as someone else in a country where discovery would have meant not just death, but international catastrophe. The mission succeeded, the threat was eliminated, and the world continued spinning without ever knowing how close it had come to ending. General Morrison pinned the star on my uniform in a ceremony attended by people whose faces appear on currency and whose decisions shape the course of nations. But with the promotion came an even heavier burden of secrecy. Generals in special operations don't just command missions, they shape policy, they advise presidents, they make decisions that affect global stability in ways that won't be declassified for generations. I spent my days in the Pentagon and in secure facilities whose locations I can't reveal, analyzing threats that existed in the spaces between countries, coordinating responses to crises that the public never knew were crises, preventing wars that would never be fought because we'd eliminated their causes before they could develop. The irony of my situation became more painful with each passing year. While my family worried about my lack of career advancement, I was briefing the Secretary of Defense on international terrorism trends. While they wondered why I couldn't afford a nicer apartment, I was coordinating million-dollar operations across multiple continents. While they encouraged me to think about going back to school for something practical, I was teaching courses at the War College on strategic intelligence analysis. While they saw failure, I was living a life of service and achievement that exceeded anything they could have imagined for their disappointing youngest son. The personal cost was enormous. I couldn't maintain relationships because I couldn't explain where I went for months at a time. I couldn't buy a house or start a family because my life belonged to missions that could call me away at any moment. I couldn't even display a single photograph or memento that would have given my family a hint of what I actually did for a living. My apartment was deliberately sparse, furnished with the kind of generic items that suggested a man who'd never quite figured out how to build a real life. My car was reliable but unremarkable, chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention or raising questions about how I could afford something better on what they assumed was a sergeant's pension. The classification levels that governed my life were like layers of an onion, each one protecting secrets that were more sensitive than the last. My family clearance was so high that even acknowledging its existence required approval from multiple agencies. The operations I'd commanded were compartmentalized so strictly that even other generals didn't know they'd happened. The intelligence I'd gathered was classified beyond the levels that appeared in any public database, stored in systems that required biometric identification and buddy system access just to be in the same room with the servers that contained it. When Marcus hired his private investigator to research my military service, the man was essentially trying to use Google to find evidence of operations that existed only in files that required presidential authorization to access. When Sarah demanded to see my DD-214, she was asking for a document that would show only my basic service record, not the classified annexes that contained the real story of my military career. When my father's brother called his contacts in military contracting to verify my claims, he was asking civilians to confirm information that was known only to a handful of people with clearances higher than most members of Congress possessed. The frustration of being unable to defend myself against their accusations was like drowning in plain sight. I'd spent years protecting them from the truth of what I did, and they'd responded by deciding that the truth was that I'd made it all up. The very security measures that kept them safe while they slept in their suburban beds were the same measures that prevented me from proving I wasn't the fraud they thought I was. The classification system that protected national security had become a prison that isolated me from the people I loved most. 3 months before the lawsuit was filed, I'd tried one last time to make them understand without violating my security oaths. We were at Sarah's house for her daughter's birthday party, surrounded by other families whose military connections, if any, consisted of watching war movies and thanking veterans for their service in grocery store checkout lines. I was standing in the backyard watching children play on a swing set that cost more than most people's cars, listening to my brother-in-law explain to another guest why he'd never served in the military because he'd been too smart to get tricked into signing his life away to the government. That's when I made my second mistake. I pulled Marcus aside and tried to explain, in the most general terms possible, that there were aspects of military service that didn't appear in public records, operations that were classified for reasons of national security, and achievements that couldn't be acknowledged publicly without compromising ongoing missions. I told him that just because something didn't show up in a Google search didn't mean it hadn't happened, that the absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, and that sometimes the most important service was the kind that could never be celebrated or acknowledged. Marcus listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a delusional relative, nodding at appropriate intervals and making sympathetic sounds that made it clear he thought I was having some kind of mental health episode. When I finished talking, he put his hand on my shoulder with the kind of gentle firmness you'd use with someone threatening to jump off a bridge. "David," he said quietly, "I understand that military service can be traumatic, and sometimes people cope with trauma by creating elaborate fantasies about their experiences. It's not your fault, and it doesn't make you a bad person, but it's not healthy to live in a world of make-believe. There are people who can help you work through this, counselors who specialize in veterans who are having trouble adjusting to civilian life. That conversation was the catalyst for everything that followed. Marcus left the party convinced that I was suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder that manifested as grandiose delusions about my military service. He shared his concerns with Sarah, who shared them with our parents, who began researching stolen valor syndrome and convinced themselves that I was a textbook case of a veteran whose modest actual service had been transformed by mental illness into an elaborate fantasy of heroism and achievement. Within a month, they'd contacted the private investigator. Within 2 months, they'd consulted with the attorney. Within 3 months, I was being served with legal papers that accused me of fraud, perjury, and emotional distress. The lawsuit consumed my life for weeks before the court date. I couldn't eat without thinking about the testimony they'd prepared, couldn't sleep without dreaming about the cross-examination that would strip away every claim I'd made about my service. Couldn't leave my apartment without wondering if the reporters who'd started following the story would be waiting with cameras and questions I couldn't answer. The weight of carrying secrets that could never be revealed was crushing enough, but carrying them while being prosecuted for lying about them was like being buried alive in a coffin made of classified documents. The morning of the hearing, I'd received one final phone call from General Morrison. Her voice was calm and professional, but I could hear something else underneath. Something that sounded like anger at a system that had put one of her officers in an impossible position. "David," she said, "I want you to know that your service has been exemplary, your conduct has been beyond reproach, and your sacrifice has been noted at the highest levels. What's happening to you today is not justice, but sometimes justice requires us to reveal truths that we'd prefer to keep hidden. Trust the process, trust your training, and remember that honor is not something that can be taken away by people who don't understand what it means." As I sat in that courtroom listening to my own attorney express doubt about my case, watching my family prepare to testify about my alleged lies and delusions, I thought about all the nights I'd spent in foreign countries where my life depended on maintaining covers that were more elaborate than anything they thought I was capable of creating. I thought about the operations I'd commanded, the soldiers I'd led, the threats I'd eliminated, the lives I'd saved, the honors I'd earned in ceremonies that would never be photographed or reported or acknowledged in any public forum. I thought about the weight of secrets that had isolated me from everyone I loved, and I wondered if the truth, when it finally came out, would be worth the cost of revealing it. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harrison took the bench with the efficient manner of someone who'd presided over hundreds of similar cases and expected this one to follow the same predictable pattern. Marcus's attorney rose to make his opening statement, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never lost a stolen valor case and didn't expect to start today. He painted a picture of a disturbed veteran whose modest service had been transformed by mental illness into an elaborate fantasy of heroism and achievement, a man who'd lied to his own family for years and was now compounding those lies in a court of law. My attorney's opening statement was brief and half-hearted, essentially admitting that unless I could produce documentation to support my claims, the case was already lost. He didn't know about the phone calls I'd received, the arrangements that had been made, or the decision that had been reached at levels of government he didn't know existed. He was preparing to lose a case that had already been decided in my favor by people whose authority superseded any civilian court in the country. The morning testimony proceeded exactly as expected. Marcus took the stand and described his investigation into my claims, his contacts with military contractors who'd found no record of my alleged service, his research into operations that appeared nowhere in any database he could access. He spoke with the conviction of someone who'd done his homework and found the truth. Completely unaware that the absence of evidence he discovered was itself evidence of the classification systems that protected the most sensitive aspects of American military operations. Sarah testified about my increasingly elaborate stories over the years, my claims about missions that sounded like something out of a movie, my insistence on maintaining what she saw as obvious lies even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. The expert witnesses were even more damaging. The psychologist testified about stolen valor syndrome, describing how veterans with modest service records sometimes developed elaborate fantasies to cope with feelings of inadequacy or trauma. The military historian explained how easy it was to research actual military operations and why my claimed participation in events that left no public record was clear evidence that I'd fabricated my entire story. The private investigator presented his findings in exhaustive detail, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that David Peterson of Fairfield, Connecticut, had never served in the capacity he claimed, never held the rank he professed, and never participated in the operations he described. By lunch break, the outcome seemed inevitable. My family sat in the gallery with expressions of vindicated sadness, sorry that it had come to this, but satisfied that the truth was finally being revealed. The reporters in the back rows were already typing up stories about another fake veteran exposed, another stolen valor case that would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to exaggerate their service for personal gain. My attorney was making notes for what would clearly be a damage control strategy rather than a defense, preparing to minimize the consequences of a case he'd already lost. That's when I noticed the commotion in the hallway outside the courtroom. Security personnel were positioning themselves at strategic points, their earpieces crackling with communications that suggested someone important was arriving. The bailiff received a call that made him straighten up and adjust his uniform. Judge Harrison was handed a note that made him pause and look toward the back of the courtroom with an expression of surprise and concern. The door opened and General Patricia Morrison walked into that courtroom wearing the kind of full-dress uniform that most people see only in movies or at state funerals. For stars gleamed on her shoulders, ribbons covered her chest in a display of decorations that represented decades of service at the highest levels of American military leadership. And her bearing commanded the kind of immediate respect that comes from authority earned through sacrifice and achievement. Every person in that courtroom, from the judge to the reporters to my own family, understood without being told that they were in the presence of someone whose word carried the weight of the United States military behind it. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, her eyes fixed on me with an expression that somehow conveyed both professional respect and personal warmth. When she reached my table, she stopped, came to attention, and rendered the crispest, most perfect military salute I'd ever received. Her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom as she said, "Good afternoon, General Peterson. It's an honor to see you again, sir." The silence that followed General Morrison's salute was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Every person in that courtroom sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. My brother Marcus's face had gone completely white, his mouth hanging open like he'd just watched the laws of physics reverse themselves. Sarah was gripping the back of the pew in front of her so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white, her eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from having your entire understanding of reality suddenly and completely overturned. My parents looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. My mother's hand pressed to her chest as if she was having trouble breathing, my father staring at me like I was a stranger who'd somehow replaced his disappointing son. Judge Harrison was the first to recover, clearing his throat and addressing General Morrison with the careful respect that civilian authority shows to military leadership when they're not entirely sure who outranks whom in the current situation. "General Morrison," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with surprise, "I wasn't aware that you were planning to testify in this case." The general turned toward the bench, her posture relaxed but commanding, and replied in the calm, authoritative tone that I remembered from briefings where she'd explained the fate of nations with the same matter-of-fact delivery. "Your Honor, I received word that there were questions about General Peterson's service record. As his former commanding officer, I felt it was important to set the record straight." The word general hit the courtroom like a physical force. Marcus actually flinched as if he'd been slapped, his attorney dropping his pen and staring at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized he'd been preparing to prosecute a case that was about to destroy his career. The reporters in the back rows were suddenly fully alert, their phones out and cameras rolling as they sensed that the routine stolen valor story they'd come to cover had just become something much bigger. Sarah was shaking her head slowly back and forth, her lips moving silently as if she was trying to convince herself that what she was hearing couldn't possibly be true. General Morrison continued speaking to the judge, but her words were clearly intended for everyone in the courtroom. General Peterson served under my command for the final 4 years of his military career, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. During that time, he led operations that I cannot discuss in detail due to their classified nature, but I can say without reservation that his service was exemplary, his conduct was beyond reproach, and his achievements were remarkable by any measure. He was promoted to brigadier general based on merit, performance, and the recommendation of multiple senior officers who recognized his exceptional capabilities. The private investigator who'd testified that morning about finding no record of my service was frantically checking his phone, probably trying to understand how he'd missed evidence of a general officer's career. The military historian who'd explained why my claims were impossible was staring at General Morrison with the expression of someone whose entire professional reputation was crumbling in real time. My own attorney was looking back and forth between General Morrison and me like he couldn't quite believe that his hopeless case had just become the legal equivalent of winning the lottery. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his judicial composure struggling to contain what was clearly fascination with the unprecedented situation unfolding in his courtroom. "General Morrison," he said carefully, "are you prepared to testify under oath about General Peterson's service record?" Without hesitation, she replied that she was not only prepared but eager to do so, and that she had brought documentation that would clarify any questions about my military career. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder that looked ordinary enough, but which I knew contained classified materials that had probably required approval from multiple cabinet-level officials to bring into a civilian courtroom. Marcus's attorney was on his feet, objecting to the introduction of evidence that hadn't been disclosed during discovery, demanding to know why the defense hadn't mentioned that they had access to a 4-star general who could authenticate their client's claims. My attorney, bless his heart, was improvising brilliantly, explaining that General Morrison's testimony had only recently become available due to the sensitive nature of the classified materials involved and the time required to obtain proper clearances for their disclosure in a civilian legal proceeding. The judge overruled the objection, noting that the pursuit of truth in his courtroom took precedence over procedural technicalities, especially when that truth involved matters of national security. General Morrison was sworn in with the same ceremony that had been used for all the other witnesses, but there was something different about watching a 4-star general raise her right hand and swear to tell the truth in a case about stolen valor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom that the person taking the oath was someone whose word carried more weight than everyone else in the room combined, someone whose integrity was quite literally a matter of national security. When she took the witness stand, she adjusted the microphone with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to being heard and understood the first time she spoke. The testimony that followed was like watching a masterclass in military precision and strategic communication. General Morrison began with my basic service record, confirming that I had indeed enlisted as an infantry soldier and served with distinction in that capacity during my early deployments. She then described the selection process that had identified me as a candidate for specialized training, the rigorous evaluation that had determined my suitability for classified operations, and the gradual progression of responsibilities that had led to my eventual promotion to general officer rank. What made her testimony devastating to my family's case wasn't just the facts she presented, but the way she presented them. This wasn't a character witness trying to help out a friend, or a superior officer protecting a subordinate. This was one of the most senior military leaders in the United States, someone whose career had been built on accuracy, precision, and absolute integrity, calmly and methodically dismantling every claim that had been made about my alleged lies and fantasies. When she described operations I had commanded, she did so with the kind of specific detail that could only come from someone who had been there, who had made the decisions to approve those operations, who had taken responsibility for their outcomes. The classified nature of my service, she explained to the courtroom, was not unusual for personnel involved in special operations and strategic intelligence. Many of our most effective military leaders have served in capacities that cannot be publicly acknowledged due to ongoing security concerns, she said, looking directly at Marcus as she spoke. The absence of public records is not evidence of deception, but rather evidence of the classification systems that protect both our national security and the safety of personnel who serve in sensitive positions. General Peterson's service falls into this category, and the fact that his achievements cannot be found in databases accessible to civilian investigators is exactly what we would expect from someone who served at his level. She produced documents from her briefcase that she described as declassified excerpts from my personnel file, carefully redacted to protect ongoing operations, but sufficient to establish the basic facts of my military career. The judge examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was looking at materials that had probably never been seen in a civilian courtroom before. The official seals, the security classifications, the signatures of senior officials, all combined to create a picture of authenticity that no amount of private investigation could have fabricated. Marcus was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, which in a very real sense was true. The brother he'd known his entire life had been a carefully constructed cover identity, designed to protect both my family and my mission from the kind of attention that could compromise operational security. The disappointed son who couldn't hold down a steady job had been a necessary fiction that allowed me to serve my country in ways that required complete anonymity. The family failure who lived in a modest apartment and drove an unremarkable car had been the perfect camouflage for someone whose real life involved briefing presidents and commanding operations that shaped global security. Sarah's face had gone through several transformations during General Morrison's testimony, from shock to disbelief to something that looked like grief. She was mourning, I realized, not just for the brother she thought she'd known, but for all the years of dismissal and condescension that could never be taken back. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to get my life together, every family gathering where she'd made jokes about my lack of achievement, every time she'd suggested that I needed professional help for my military fantasies, all of it was being recontextualized in light of the truth that General Morrison was revealing. My parents looked like they were watching their entire understanding of their family dissolve in real time. My mother was crying, not tears of joy or pride, but tears of loss and confusion and regret. My father had his head in his hands, probably calculating how many years of family dinners he'd spent encouraging his youngest son to get serious about his future, while that son was serving his country at a level that exceeded anything my father had ever achieved in his own career. The weight of their mistake was settling over them like a physical force, and I could see in their faces that they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. The cross-examination that followed was brief and devastating to the plaintiff's case. Marcus's attorney, clearly realizing that his client had just sued a decorated general for stolen valor, attempted to question General Morrison about the specifics of my service, only to be told repeatedly that the information was classified above his clearance level and could not be disclosed in a public forum. When he suggested that the classified nature of my service was convenient for someone trying to hide lies about their military career, General Morrison's response was ice cold and final. "Counselor," she said, "I have been serving this country for 32 years, and I have never once compromised classified information to win a legal argument or protect someone's reputation. If you are suggesting that I would perjure myself in a court of law to cover up stolen valor, then you are not only wrong, but you are insulting the integrity of every person who has ever worn this uniform." The attorney quickly backed down, realizing that attacking the credibility of a four-star general in front of a judge, jury, and room full of reporters was a career-ending move that would accomplish nothing except ensuring that he never practiced law again. He mumbled something about having no further questions and returned to his seat beside Marcus, who was staring at the table in front of him like he was trying to will himself to disappear. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, probably to give everyone in the courtroom time to process what they'd just witnessed. During the break, I could hear the frantic conversations happening in the gallery as reporters called their editors to explain that the stolen valor story they'd come to cover had just become a story about a family that had sued their own son for being too successful in military service to talk about it publicly. Marcus and Sarah huddled with their attorney, their voices low and urgent as they tried to figure out how to extract themselves from a lawsuit that had just become a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. When court resumed, Marcus's attorney stood up and addressed the judge with the weary tone of someone who knew he was about to surrender in the most humiliating way possible. "Your Honor," he said, "in light of the testimony we've heard today, my clients would like to withdraw their complaint and issue a formal apology to the defendant." Judge Harrison nodded as if he'd been expecting this outcome since the moment General Morrison had walked into his courtroom. He asked if I had any objection to the dismissal of charges, and I replied that I had no desire to prolong proceedings that had already accomplished their purpose of establishing the truth. But General Morrison wasn't finished. She asked permission to make a brief statement for the record, and when the judge granted it, she stood and addressed the courtroom with the kind of command presence that made everyone understand why she'd reached the highest levels of military leadership. She spoke about the nature of service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, about the sacrifice required from military families who had to accept that their loved ones' achievements might never be celebrated or even understood. She talked about the cost of protecting national security, not just for the people who served in classified positions, but for their families who had to live with the absence of explanation and recognition that came with that service. Most importantly, she addressed my family directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," she said, "your son has served this country with exceptional distinction and personal sacrifice. The fact that you were not aware of the full extent of his service is not a failure on your part, but rather evidence of his commitment to the security protocols that govern classified operations. I hope that going forward, you will understand that David's reticence about his military career was not deception, but rather the kind of discretion that we expect from our most trusted officers." The formal apology that followed was as painful as it was necessary. Marcus stood up in front of the packed courtroom, his voice shaking as he addressed me directly. "David," he said, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened in this courtroom. We accused you of lying about your service when the truth was that we were too small-minded to understand the possibility that you might have served in ways we couldn't comprehend. We sued you for stolen valor when we should have been thanking you for your sacrifice. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover what I owe you, but it's where I have to start." Sarah's apology was even more difficult to watch. She was crying openly as she spoke, her voice breaking as she tried to find words for the magnitude of her mistake. She talked about all the times she'd dismissed my military stories as fantasies, all the conversations where she'd suggested I needed mental help, all the years she'd treated me like a delusional brother who couldn't accept reality. Her words came out in a rush of regret and shame, and I could see that she was finally understanding not just what I'd done in service to our country, but what they'd all done to me in their ignorance of that service. My parents' apology was the hardest to hear because it carried the weight of decades of disappointment and misunderstanding. My father spoke about the son he thought he'd raised, the one who'd chosen the easy path of military service instead of building a real career, and how he now understood that he'd been looking at military service through the lens of his own limited experience and expectations. My mother talked about the worry she'd carried for years, thinking I was struggling to find my place in the world, never realizing that I'd found not just my place, but my calling in service that she'd never been able to understand. The aftermath of the hearing was surreal. Reporters surrounded General Morrison as she left the courthouse, trying to get quotes about classified military operations and being politely but firmly told that some things were more important than headlines. My family stood in the parking lot looking lost and confused, probably wondering how they were going to explain to their friends and neighbors that they'd just sued their war hero brother for being too good at his job to talk about it. The private investigator who'd testified about my non-existent service record was already on his phone, probably trying to explain to his other clients why his research methods had just been exposed as completely inadequate for investigating classified military careers. But the most important conversation happened that evening at my parents' house, where my family gathered for what felt like the first honest discussion we'd had in years. We sat around the same dining room table where they'd laughed at my military stories, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. There was a new respect in the way they looked at me, but also a profound sadness as they began to understand the cost of the silence I'd maintained to protect both national security and their own peace of mind. Marcus was the first to really grasp the implications of what had been revealed. "You've been living a completely different life," he said quietly, "and we never even knew it existed. All those times we thought you were struggling to find yourself, you were actually serving at a level that none of us could have imagined. All those deployments we thought were just regular military assignments were actually classified operations that probably saved lives we'll never know about. We spent years feeling sorry for you when we should have been grateful to you." Sarah asked the question that had been hanging in the air since General Morrison's testimony. "How do you forgive us for what we put you through? How do you not hate us for suing you, for calling you a liar, for treating you like you were mentally ill?" Her voice was small and broken, and I could see that she was genuinely struggling with the magnitude of what they'd done. The answer came to me easily because it was the same answer I'd given myself during all those years of carrying secrets that isolated me from the people I loved most. I told them that forgiveness wasn't something they needed to earn because love doesn't keep a ledger of mistakes and misunderstandings. I explained that the hardest part of my service hadn't been the danger or the loneliness or even the weight of carrying classified information, but the knowledge that I couldn't share the most important parts of my life with the people who mattered most to me. I said that being sued for stolen valor by my own family had been painful, but not as painful as watching them struggle to understand why I seemed so different after each deployment, why I couldn't talk about my work, why I lived so modestly despite clearly being capable of more. The conversation that followed went late into the night, with my family asking careful questions about the parts of my service I could discuss and accepting gracefully when I explained that some things would always have to remain classified. They began to understand that the brother and son they thought they'd known had been real, but incomplete, like a photograph with half the image carefully cropped away. The David who came to family dinners and lived quietly in his modest apartment was genuinely me, but he was only part of the whole picture that included the general who'd briefed presidents and commanded operations across multiple continents. My mother asked the question that probably required the most courage. "Are you angry with us? Are you hurt that we couldn't see who you really were?" The honest answer was complicated because it involved years of accumulated frustration and disappointment, but also an understanding that they'd reacted to the information available to them in a way that made sense from their perspective. I told her that I'd been hurt, but not angry, because anger would have required me to believe that they should have somehow divined the truth about classified operations from the absence of evidence in public records. Over the following weeks, my family's behavior toward me changed in ways both subtle and profound. Marcus stopped offering career advice and started asking for it, recognizing that someone who'd reached general officer rank probably understood leadership and strategy better than he did. Sarah began introducing me to her friends differently, not as her underachieving brother who'd served in the military, but as her brother who'd had a distinguished military career that she was proud of even though she couldn't discuss the details. My parents started displaying military memorabilia in their house for the first time, small tokens that acknowledged the son they'd finally learned to see clearly. The media attention from the court case brought unexpected challenges. Several news outlets wanted to do feature stories about the family that had sued their war hero son, but we declined all interviews by mutual agreement. The last thing any of us wanted was more public attention that might compromise operational security or turn our private reconciliation into a public spectacle. General Morrison had made it clear that while the basic facts of my service were now public record, the details would remain classified, and we all understood that some prices were too high to pay for fame or vindication. The most meaningful change was in how we communicated as a family. The careful distance that had characterized our relationships for years gave way to a new kind of honesty and respect. They stopped trying to fix me or worry about my future, and I stopped feeling like I had to justify my choices or defend my life to people who couldn't understand the context in which those choices had been made. We found a new equilibrium based on trust rather than understanding, acceptance rather than explanation. 6 months after the court case, we gathered for Marcus's birthday dinner at the same restaurant where we'd celebrated family milestones for decades. The conversation was easy and natural, flowing between family news and current events without the undercurrent of tension that had marked our interactions for years. When Marcus raised his glass to toast another year of life, he included a toast to family members who served in ways we might not always understand but always respected. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment of reconciliation, just a simple acknowledgement that our family had grown into a new understanding of what it meant to love and support each other. The lawsuit that had threatened to destroy our family had ultimately brought us closer together than we'd ever been. The truth that I'd spent years hiding to protect them had finally set us all free from the misunderstandings and assumptions that had kept us strangers living in the same family. The secrets that had isolated me had been replaced by a new kind of relationship based on respect for boundaries and appreciation for sacrifice, even when that sacrifice couldn't be fully understood or publicly acknowledged. I still live quietly, still drive an unremarkable car, still maintain the kind of low profile that years of classified service have made second nature. But now my family understands that simplicity is a choice rather than a limitation, that privacy is a professional requirement rather than personal inadequacy, and that some of the most important service happens in shadows where recognition is impossible and gratitude is classified. They learned that honor isn't always loud, sacrifice isn't always visible, and heroes don't always get parades. The most important lesson we all learned was that family love is strong enough to survive even the deepest misunderstandings, and that truth, when it finally emerges, has the power to heal wounds that seemed permanent and bridge gaps that seemed insurmountable. We discovered that it's possible to love someone completely without understanding them fully, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a family member is the trust to let them carry secrets that protect both national security and family peace. As I finish this story, I want you to remember that quiet strength is still strength, that hidden service is still service, and that the people in your life who seem ordinary might be carrying extraordinary burdens that they can't share but shouldn't have to carry alone. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never get recognized, and sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose victories can never be celebrated publicly. Look around at the people in your life and ask yourself if you really know their whole story, if you've made assumptions about their choices or limitations that might not reflect the complete picture of who they are and what they've done. Give them the benefit of the doubt, the respect they've earned through service you might not understand, and the love that doesn't require complete knowledge to be complete itself. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying with me through this journey of family, service, and the complicated relationship between truth and secrecy. I hope it reminds you that everyone deserves to be seen clearly, loved fully, and respected deeply, especially when their greatest achievements must remain hidden in service to something larger than themselves.